Donald Trump is heading back to the White House.
Together we can truly make America great again.
We are in for an unpredictable but fascinating 4 years.
And we're going to be following every twist and turn for the first 100 days. We'll be bringing you the latest updates and analysis first thing every morning. So join me, James Matthews.
Me, Martha Kelnick.
And me, Mark Stone.
For Trump 100, every weekday at 6 a.m, wherever you get your podcasts.
Hello, good morning, and welcome to Politics at Jack and Sam's Daily, the podcast that's so stubborn it's going to refuse to change its name for the time being, even though my co-host has left me and relocated to America. Traitor, although I'm sure he'll be granted a pardon for leaving me, just like pretty much everyone else seemed to get overnight over there. We are still here, however, to give you everything you need to know about the day ahead in British politics in under 20 minutes, and if America can put a man on Mars, I can find a new co-host. So I am delighted that helping me today is the esteemed Anne McElvoy from Politico, executive editor, broadcaster, political journalist extraordinaire. Hello, Anne.
Hello, Sam. And I'm really enjoying being here and just trying to kind of vibe myself into being Jack, but more like Anne meets Jack, Jack meets Anne, who knows?
Anne is one of those journalists pretty much known to everyone in Westminster, impeccably sourced. She's been everywhere. She's going to bring all that wealth of experience to our podcast. So I'm delighted that she's here. So as somebody once said rather recently, the golden age starts now. Now, following the noble tradition of this podcast, it doesn't look like you're at home, but you're on your travels. That looks like a media centre room more than your front room. At least I hope it is, because it's got a big World Economic Forum sign in it, and it'd be very weird if that was your living room. Where are you?
Well, I think you've just given it away there, haven't you, Sam? You've stolen my thunder. I'm indeed at Davos at the World Economic Forum. So I'm in a rather swish media centre. The Swiss do these things rather well. The day's getting going here in that early Davos way, politicians being whisked around in those big black cars that are everywhere, to breakfast meetings, to the glad handings, and occasionally being accosted by journalists along the way as we slither through the quite icy Davos this morning.
A lot of people take the mickey out of Davos, but the bottom line is, if you're a journalist, there are just a lot of powerful, important and well-connected people. So it's a brilliant place to go and just take the temperature of all sorts of things, which is what we're going to be doing with you a little bit later. Now, this podcast is where we tell you about the impact of global events specifically on Britain and Westminster. But the truth is that for all their preparations, special subcommittees and working papers, even Number 10 don't know what Donald Trump is doing until they see it on giant TV screens in the office. And that was definitely true on Inauguration Day yesterday. So everybody is getting to grips with what's happening over the Atlantic at the same time. So I'm just going to spend a bit of time talking through a little bit of the stuff that emerged overnight that's relevant to the UK. We found out that the UK and other countries wouldn't be subject to immediate export tariffs as part of Trump's day one executive orders. People found this out, including in Downing Street, by a wire service only a couple of hours before the inauguration. So that gives you a sense of how British politics is and British politicians are dealing with unfolding events at the same rate as the rest of us. However, because US sort of events in the Trump administration is very much operating to its own timetable without much reference to the rest of the world, there is a packed day in British politics here as well, all with, of course, what's going on in America on TV screens in the background. But Anne, do you want to just start running through the key events that we're going to be looking at in a bit today?
Yes, well, unusually, we will hear from the Prime Minister early on in a Downing Street press conference at 8:30 a.m. Now, this isn't a press conference taking on Trump and that question of tariffs that you mentioned, Sam. It's being billed as an address in response to the harrowing murder of those three young girls in late July last year in Southport at the Taylor Swift themed workshop. Such a horrific event lodged in all of our psyche, fueled by social media. A lot of questions still to come about the backdrop that led to that, and of course the rioting which followed it in the UK. That was Keir Starmer's first major challenge.
It does feel like British politics on split screen, America in the left-hand side of the screen, and what the Prime Minister is going to be saying on Southport in the other half.
Absolutely.
We had been expecting this trial, which was of the man arrested at the scene, Axel Rudakubana, to spin over some weeks. And sort of the timing has been upended because unexpectedly, he pleaded guilty to the charges yesterday, including critically terror-related charges. But the big reveal came from politicians immediately after the guilty plea in the House of Commons, where Yvette Cooper revealed that he actually, this 18-year-old, was well known to the authorities. He was referred to prevent the anti-terrorism programme 3 times. He slipped through the net, and we don't fully know how. So that's why the Prime Minister is going to go and try and get on top of that. We'll talk a bit more about that major domestic story in a moment. What else is going on in Britain today?
Well, elsewhere, Technology Secretary Peter Kyle is at his new East London tech campus, showing how AI can speed up public services. Big push on this in Whitehall, Sam. Also to roll it out into the NHS, because it's very much part of a tie-up that Peter Kyle has with Wes Streeting on what might drive NHS reform.
You call it a tie-up. I'd call it a very close friendship. They're two of the closest friends.
That is true. That is true. But out of this close friendship has come, if you like, a policy friendship. And I think this is going to be quite interesting to see whether this can really push things along as fast as both of them hope. I don't know if you know this, Sam, that the new service is called Humphrey after, guess who?
Sir Humphrey from Yes Minister, a cute reference to Westminster Wall.
Yeah, 10 points. So tech bros might occupy the first row seats in Washington, but they've certainly worked their way into the British government too. Meanwhile, as the number one at the Treasury, Rachel Reeves, flies out to join me in Davos. This is the way I like to think about it. Her deputy, Darren Jones, is giving a speech, giving us clues about how the government is going to meet its economic challenges. And the theme of that is we're going to do things differently, because if we do them the same, we'll get the same old results. But what does different look like?
The biggest challenge for the government this year. Look, it sounds as if the Chancellor, who will also be giving a big speech, but next week, will give the green light to runways at Heathrow and possibly Gatwick as well, as Bloomberg was reporting yesterday. And this will be a big test of the government's commitment to growth. Officially, they're not confirming it, but all the signs are there that a new runway at Heathrow, something that Ed Miliband opposed for years when he was leader. Now we've flocked back to the opposite position, is on the agenda. And one final thing, it's Tuesday morning, and every Tuesday morning we have the latest YouGov Sky Times voting intention, basically unchanged on last week. Labour on 26, Reform on 24, Tories on 22, Lib Dems on 14, and Greens on 9. That's just your weekly update.
But first and most importantly, cutting through the noise, and my goodness, there is a lot of it. What has Donald Trump done overnight that matters to British politics in the UK? Well, let's look to that barrage of executive orders. It was hard to keep up with them. But Sam, what did you think the most important were?
Well, I've been scrolling through the nearly 200 different things that we know that he's done. It's a little bit hard. We don't have all the detail at the moment. We're relying on some of his comments and his commentary accompanying the scenes of him signing various documents. But the thing that has struck people immediately was this decision not to impose immediate tariffs, certainly not in a way that's going to hit the UK immediately. Now, the UK is exposed. There's no doubt about that. The US is one of the biggest export markets. We've got £60 billion of goods going over there. So whether or not the tariffs on some or all of those goods were imposed on day one has been a matter of great big government concern. And actually, Donald Trump aimed off. He talked specifically about forcing tariffs on Canada and Mexico, maybe as much as 25% from February the 1st. He threatened 100% tariffs on Beijing if they didn't sell TikTok to a US company, or at least half of it. And he also talked about tariffs on EU products unless they bought more American oil. So nothing specific about Britain in that. So brief sigh of relief, I think. The other things that really mattered to Britain were withdrawing from the Paris Climate Change Pact, and really the whole process of those COP climate change conferences that will make getting global agreements, particularly getting China in line, which is always a difficulty at those events, even more difficult. And he also withdrew from the World Health Organization in a sort of fascinating echo of those Brexit arguments. One of the big reason that he gave was the scale of American contributions to the World Health Organization, which on a per head basis dwarf those of China. And so he made the argument that it basically costs too much. And the kind of subject like tariffs, hugely important to the British economy. Do you think there's a bit of a sigh of relief? And more generally, because you can suck up the reaction from politicians, aides and business people, what has been the first sort of the moment that people have been able to draw breath about the opening of Donald Trump? What were they saying?
I think on the UK front, there's a sense at the moment, as you say, this is all emerging what it really means, but that we look like we may have got away reasonably lightly, and that there is some relief about that, and also the appointment of an ambassador to the UK who looks like he's there to pursue financial deals or perhaps even something broader. So I think there's a fair amount of optimism in people I'm talking to on the trade side of the UK government. In terms of Davos, I was sitting at a table last night, a Dutch entrepreneur, Belgian finance guy, a mix of people and some UK business folk. I think exactly as you say, they're waiting to see what Trump really means by the tariff threat, and crucially where it falls, because if tariffs fall somewhere where you're looking for a competitive advantage, well, you're actually quite happy about that. If they fall on China and on Mexico, on those big targets, well, a lot of European companies will be phew. That's fine. We can pretty much carry on as before. But I think there is a lot of confusion about what is going to happen, for instance, on electric vehicles, where we saw Donald Trump doubling back really on what he'd appeared to lean into, Elon Musk, and to the Tesla agenda on that. But no, yesterday it was not a favourable set of comments about supporting electric vehicles and supporting that sector. How does that then play for competitors in Europe? Well, it's all a long chain and it will unfold, I'm sure, in the next weeks and months. But that was what people were talking about here.
The UK has spent weeks drawing up something of a playbook in how to deal with yesterday, today, this week, this month, and the sort of return of the Donald 2.0. And it's got a number of strands to it. First and foremost, I think politically, Downing Street is desperate that it doesn't pick a public fight with Donald Trump. So that means not only instructing members of the cabinet and ministers not to be drawn whenever Donald Trump says something provocative, but hoping that the rest of the Labour Party, and I think they're looking at Sadiq Khan, looking at you here, don't do that as well. And the second is there's a little bit of a sort of fingers crossed element to it. That the hope inside government is that when it comes to the UK, we might end up only having sector by sector tariffs rather than blanket tariffs on every single good that is exported to the UK. So the hope is that maybe Donald Trump just looks at particular industries that he campaigned, that he mentioned during his election campaign. So things like steel and aluminium and technology and cars. So there is a chance that big parts of our manufacturing will be hurt, but it isn't the totality. And that alone would be seen by a bit of a win inside government, just it not being applied to everything. Because our response seems to be quite clear that we're not going to go in guns blazing, just as that we don't want a rhetorical war, we don't want a trade war, so we wouldn't take a protectionist approach to US tariffs, and we might not respond in a tit-for-tat way. Now, I have to say, Anne, this is absolutely fascinating, because this is a big difference from the way that it looks at this stage like the EU might respond. So this is a huge choice for Britain. If the EU are hit by tariffs, then they will slap tariffs back on import goods from America, on things like Harley Davidsons and Levi jeans. But we wouldn't take the same approach, it seems, at this stage.
That's really interesting. If I just chip in something there, Sam, because that is, I'm fascinated by this, particularly if you look at this sort of agenda of Keir Starmer moving closer to the European Union. But how close do you want to be on this in particular? We can do exactly as you say, and perhaps get those more, if you look, like pick and mix deals if we're not in the customs union. Of course, there are some, including the Lib Dems, who'd like to see us back in a customs union or something very similar with the EU. It's really interesting, that, isn't it?
Just to explain, if you're a member of the customs union, the European Union customs union, you have to sign up to their tariffs. So Brussels gets to decide whether or not you impose tariffs on US goods if there's a trade war. UK, famously, notably post-Brexit, is not part of the customs union, but as you just mentioned, the Lib Dems would quite like to take us back. So we have got autonomy in deciding how we respond. We wouldn't do if we were part of the European Union, and in a big signal, it looks as if the UK could do different things to the EU in this, and that's just about one of the biggest decisions we'll have taken post our exit from the EU.
True that.
Now. The other thing that is happening is, by the way that Trump is sort of delaying the tariff decision, is it's buying a bit more time for Britain. And that matters because the big task of the incoming ambassador, Peter Mandelson, is to sort of reduce the threat of tariffs to the UK wherever possible, if he gets to do the job. Now, he is due, as we were saying yesterday, to fly to the US next month in February to present his credentials. There are lots of signals, growing signals, that the Trump administration, very unhappy, much preferred the incumbent Karen Pierce, may reject Lord Mandelson. Anne, what do you think the latest is on that?
Well, Downing Street have been very keen to say that these rumours that the new president, returned president, isn't keen on Lord Mandelson, that they're not true, but they do keep on coming, and they keep coming from different sources. So we should take them perhaps a bit more seriously. And The Independent has some fresh reporting in today's paper that doesn't make great reading for Peter Mandelson, and it has a Trump team figure saying that the president is minded to reject Mandelson's credentials, but maybe would give a conditional approval on a very short lease. It sounds like something you get at a sort of Airbnb rather than moving into the Washington embassy. I don't think you really want a very short lease if you're going to establish yourself as a major power player in Washington, as Karen Pierce, the outgoing ambassador, most certainly was. Of course, some of this may also be political rivals or people who just like a bit of trouble stirring it up. The expectation still seems to be that Peter Mandelson will get there. It's not really in the president's gift to block it, but you wouldn't really want to send an ambassador that President Trump didn't want to talk to, particularly with all of this trade business to be done, which was the reason for sending Peter Mandelson in the first place. He has a background and expertise in that. You never really know, do you, Sam? With Trump world, it's very hard to say, this is going to go away. Sometimes things just have a habit of coming back, and sometimes he just drops them and moves on. And Peter Mandelson, I think, is in the holding pattern on that one.
You say Downing Street say it's not true. I've heard the government sources call it barroom gossip.
That is sometimes true, though, isn't it?
But that's nonsense. Just to really call out Downing Street on that is not true. This is an issue. As you say, Lord Mandelson might end up being the ambassador. There's going to be a huge diplomatic effort. It'll form part of the David Lammy and the Keir Starmer visit to the US, lobbying for Mandelson to be accepted by Trumpland. But the idea that this isn't a thing, I can absolutely tell you from my sources, it is. The idea that David Mannix in The Independent was writing about, that essentially you chain Peter Mandelson and prevent him from doing anything about China being one of the big things that Trumpland is worried about in relation to Peter Mandelson. That also feels pretty terminal if they actually impose conditions. Doesn't feel like they'll do that and he would survive as ambassador. Let's see how it plays out. As you say, it would be a high stakes thing, but to say it's not an issue is from my understanding, my reporting and my colleagues' reporting, simply not right. Naughty Downing Street. Right. Do you want to talk about the other big story of the day, Anne?
Yes, in the absence of the US inauguration, we would be focusing much more heavily this morning on the guilty plea by Axel Rudakubana over the late July murders in Southport. They were the start of a chain of events that led to a summer of unrest. And Keir Starmer's first major challenge as Prime Minister in dealing with that and connecting with a shocked and traumatised community and country. And after his guilty plea at Liverpool Crown Court, which wasn't expected, Yvette Cooper revealed that Rudakubana had contact with the police, with the courts, extensively with the youth justice system, with social services and mental health services prior to that killing spree last summer. She and Keir Starmer have been straight up that there's been a major failing of the state, as they're calling it here. The government wants to get on top of this, hence the decision to announce a public inquiry very swiftly yesterday, and Starmer doing a press conference today. And this level of action feels, well, almost frenetic. I don't know what you make of that, Sam.
I think Keir Starmer can spot two political problems which flow from the guilty plea by Radic Abana. The first immediate one is evident from space, and that's because what the state missed, admittedly before Keir Starmer became Prime Minister, and I'm sure possibly as a consequence of other people's leadership, but nevertheless, what the state missed makes incredibly difficult reading this morning. Look, Lancashire Police had several interactions with Radic Abana between late 2019 and May 2022, including responding to 5 calls from his home over his behaviour. You know, he was referred 3 times to the Counter-Terrorism Prevent programme up to April 2021. He has accepted. He's pleaded guilty on a terrorism charge today, but they closed his case. And one of the referrals related to the fact that Radic Abana had been showing an interest in the killing children in the school massacre, which has horrible echoes of what really happened. And a week earlier, the killer had been stopped by his father from carrying out an attack on the school that expelled him the year before. So you'll hear more about that on Thursday when the prosecutors set out what their evidence, if the trial had gone ahead, would have been. But the political charge, and this is where it starts getting really knotty, and I suspect the motivation for this morning's press conference is more complicated. With both Kemi Badenoch and Nigel Farage are on the attacks, they sent problems. And Badenoch is asking what Starmer and others in authority knew about Radic Abana and why details about, for instance, you know, the links and where he came from, the role of the state wasn't disclosed earlier. Meanwhile, Nigel Farage is going to say, look, I was asking about whether or not authorities knew about him within 24 hours. And this is where it gets tricky. When the murders happened, the police said, despite finding an Al-Qaeda manual in his house, they said the incident was not being treated as terrorism related. And effectively, some politicians started to call them out or question that particular fact. So we're right back to this really toxic, difficult political question for Keir Starmer of whether there is any issue around cultural sensitivities at play as to why the authorities responded in the way that they did. And how can Keir Starmer head off that charge if he has to stand before the public and the media this morning?
This is going to be very difficult, isn't it? I think there are at least 2 levels here and probably more to come as we hear more of this detail. Very depressing it is too that this teenager went through so many institutions, so many checks that just seem to have failed to have prevented this attack. And I think Nigel Farage has his own reasons for the tone that he's taking here, and I'm sure that Kemi Badenoch will also, in her own way, be very critical. But they do seem to have a point when they say that perhaps in the earlier hours and the first days, it did seem to be kind of quashed this idea that there might be a terror background to this, and there was much more, a narrative seemed to be building up that this was a troubled teenager with mental health problems. And I think that they will be pursuing the line, and Keir Starmer will have to answer for it for the government, but so will many other institutions and the police, as to, well, was that picture accurate? It's not, I think, that people were desperately trying to keep things from the British public. They were going to come out anyway. But there is a question about transparency, and there's always a question when people feel very shocked and also are thinking, well, was I not told something? Were they trying to keep it away from us in order perhaps to prevent public unrest, which clearly didn't work because we did have massive public unrest over that summer.
The Prime Minister, I suspect, will argue that if he'd said too much, or if the authorities had said too much, that could have jeopardised any future trial, and his first job is to ensure justice for the victims. But we have crashed over our 20-minute limit. Thank you very much indeed for joining me, Anne. I think we will see you again tomorrow morning. But until then, bye-bye.
Great to be side-saddle with you, Sam. Bye-bye.
Donald Trump is heading back to the White House.
Together we can truly make America great again.
We are in for an unpredictable but fascinating 4 years.
And we're going to be following every twist and turn for the first 100 days. We'll be bringing you the latest updates and analysis first thing every morning. So join me, James Matthews.
Me, Martha Kellner.
And me, Mark Stone.
For Trump 100 every weekday at 6 a.m, wherever you get your podcasts.